I want to tell you a story about my studio. My studio was designed for me by Robert Busby, and many of you know and loved Robert Busby. He was a fixture in Old Town. And Robert died very soon before I was to move into my studio. And I went to his funeral, and I bet a lot of you were at his funeral too, a big funeral. And I introduced myself to some of his brothers who had come up from Tennessee. And I got to thinking that since Robert was always a man of his word, that Robert and I had no written understanding that this was supposed to be my studio. And so we didn't have any documentation about the fact that it was going to be my studio and what I was going to pay in terms of monthly rent. So I went up to one of his brothers and introduced myself. And I said, "You know that space above the Creole Gallery?" And his brother said, "Yes." I said, "Well, that's supposed to be my studio." And he said, "We wondered what that was," because they said we walked in and it looked for all the world to us like a living room, but it had a sink in it. And we couldn't figure out why there would be a sink in a living room. Well, there's a sink so I can wash out my brushes. But I also thought, well, gosh, it is going to be a kind of living room for me, because this is where people are going to come to visit me and to see my art. So I decided that I would decorate my studio as though it were a living room with a sink in it and a very messy table, which is where all my brushes and oils are. So I'm sitting on this lush, plush couch, and I invite people when they come to see me to sit down, and it gives them a chance to look around and be comfortable at the same time. Because one of the things that you'll notice when you walk in my studio is that it looks like I have art here hanging that has been done by maybe 17 different people, because I do such a different variety of art. I do the crazy constructions, and those crazy constructions remind you that you can make art out of anything. So you don't need to buy, expensive oils or canvases or brushes. You can just pick up stuff, and if you have a good imagination, put it together in an interesting way. And then I make the really serious stuff, like the painting, the series having to do with the prisoners, that sort of thing. Some of my work is abstract, some of it is quite representational or realistic. And so it takes a little while sometimes for people to absorb all of this. So I thought, well, if they could sit down, maybe they could just sort of stop being overwhelmed and begin to see that even though there is quite an eclectic variety of art that I do and different kinds of images, that they all do somehow reflect this crazy person that greets them at the door. Because as I say in my statement, these are all thin sections of my brain. Everything that anybody creates is an externalization of themselves. It's really quite remarkable. Even when you bake cookies, you are externalizing your love for someone else. If you're a mother and you bake cookies for your children when they arrive from school, you're saying to your children, I thought about you during the day and I made you cookies. So here is an expression of my love. Now, you're not going to say that to them, and they're not going to say, wow, this is an expression of mom's love or dad's love. Depends on who's doing the baking here, I guess. But they will internalize that as a gesture of your love. Well, the same thing with my paintings. My paintings are externalizations of the things that I think about. And you can see from just a few pieces that I've shown you in this film and the images that are in the gallery on the website, I think about a lot of different kinds of things. I think about politics. I think about imprisonment. I think about suffering. I think about pain. I think about jokes. I think about Barbie. And I make fun of Barbie because I think Barbie has caused a lot of harm to young girls. Because here is this crazy idealized, quote unquote, vision of what young girls should look like. And no young girl can hope ever to look like this, because Barbie is really distorted. She's a distorted version of a woman's body. So that's why I do things like I rip Barbie apart. And you know, those of you who are very familiar with Barbies will not find this to be news, but this is something that I learned, that it used to be really easy to tear Barbie's head off. And when most people were young girls, because Barbie came out, I think, in 1957 originally, it was quite easy for kids to take the heads off the Barbie and they would exchange heads, you know. Well, then Mattel decided that this was dangerous. So now it's hard to get Barbie's heads off. And it's hard to get Barbie's legs off. I mean, you can't break it open. The plastic is so hard. So Barbie is perfectly safe now as a toy to play with in terms of physical danger to the eyes or hands or stomach. Don't want to eat a Barbie's head. But she's still dangerous in terms of what she does to people's heads. And you know, I do the same thing to Barbie as I do to high heel shoes. Because high heel shoes are a kind of control mechanism that society devised, you know, a long time ago to limit women's physical movement. There was a tradition in China for thousands of years that some of you, I'm sure, have heard of, is foot binding, where the women's feet were bound so small. The ideal was to get a 3-inch long foot that would be shaped like a lotus blossom. Well, women whose feet were bound couldn't move very well. But boy, were they sexy as far as the men were concerned. So the women bound their daughters' feet to make them marriageable. Now, the Chinese communists, one good thing they did do was they outlawed this practice. But you can still find in places like Chinatown in San Francisco, you can find antique shoes that these women wore, and they'll break your heart. But a high heel shoe that you can still buy today does something very similar, because it crams your toes into that very pointed toe box. So when you get older, your toes are going to hurt and have corns and calluses and all sorts of things. It makes the muscles of your legs different lengths, because it stretches out the muscles in the front of your calf and it shrinks the muscles in the back of your calf. So then if you take off your high heel shoes after wearing them all day, when you walk around, your feet hurt. Now, it should be that your feet hurt when you're in shoes, and they do, but you just don't notice it because you think you're glamorous. So I have a lot of my art that actually mutilates shoes, because that's my revenge against high heels. One of my favorite pieces, I don't have a photograph of it, which is a shame. I sold it during my first show. And it's a wine box, and it's called the Naturalizer, and that's a brand of a shoe. I don't know whether they still make Naturalizers or not. They probably do. That's so ironic. Because there's nothing natural about it, right? And so I did this whole visual effect in the shoebox, and then the shoe is in there, and it is standing in for a bound shoe. And there are other pieces of my art that do the same thing. I have a piece that is going to be on the gallery, and it's called "I Know Why the Caged Shoe Sings." Well, many of you have heard of Maya Angelou's autobiography, "I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings." So what I did was I took a high heel shoe. It's a very glamorous high heel shoe, and I distorted it, I contorted it in order to get it into a little finch cage. And I put all sorts of little goodies for that shoe in there. The door still opens to the cage, but the shoe can't get out. And that's just the way it should be. High heel shoes should not be let out.